Welcome back to Cool Seminary Tutorials. Hi, I'm Professor Wendy. Today I'm excited to take a look with you at primary and secondary sources for history. When they're used the right way, primary and secondary sources allow us to get a quick but as accurate as possible snapshot from the past, as in the lives and circumstances of our ancestors. They also make possible great discoveries to share with the world, as in an archaeological dig that reveals fascinating secrets from long ago. So what are primary and secondary sources for history? What's the difference between them? I'm glad you asked. Primary sources are original first-hand documents and artifacts. Things like letters, journals, memoirs, photos, art and architecture, and official records of birth, baptism, immigration, marriage, death, and the like. For example, if you write a letter to your Aunt Gertrude, that letter is a first-hand original document of what you communicated to her, so be careful what you write. Secondary sources, on the other hand, are interpretations of history, often in published form. Secondary sources include history books and videos, biographies, and most newspaper and magazine articles. For example, if your Uncle Fred writes a magazine article that summarizes what you said in your letter to Aunt Gertrude, that article is a secondary source of history because it expresses your uncle's interpretation of what you wrote in your letter to Aunt Gertrude. The thing to remember is secondary sources are filtered through someone else's interpretation. Most of us have gotten most of our history from secondary sources like history books and newspapers, because these secondary sources are often easier to access and use than archival collections and archaeological dig sites. Let's look at another example using, hypothetically, your tax payment record to demonstrate the difference between primary and secondary sources. Your chief competitor could make a malicious claim in a newspaper article, say, which is a secondary source of information, that you failed to pay your taxes in 2011. But you could prove for a fact that you did indeed pay your taxes in 2011 if you could produce the original primary documents that serve as evidence that you did so. You could then set the historical record right by requiring a retraction of the false secondary statement that had failed to take into account the official record. The difference between your tax record and most history is that it's relatively easy for you to correct the record about your taxes because you have those primary documents, and if you're watching this video, that probably means you're alive. By comparison, when false information or bad interpretations are written after someone's dead, it's much harder for someone else to dig out and correct the record. But this is part of the fun and worthy work of the historian. There are parallels between the work of a detective and the work of a historian, both in finding primary historical evidence and in correctly interpreting that evidence in secondary sources for the benefit of others. So to summarize, primary sources provide original evidence from history, secondary sources offer interpretation of history, often in published form. I'm Professor Wendy. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to leave feedback, ask questions, and click to subscribe to Cool Seminary Tutorials. Most of all, have fun learning.